Hi everyone, my name is Casey Ramirez, and for my TOK Final Presentation, I'm going to be talking about domestic violence, primarily violence against women. So, when we think about domestic violence and violence against women, you think of physical assault and sexual assault. So both of those two things come into play when you think of domestic violence. So, I'm going to give you some statistics, and 1 in every 4 women are assaulted. 1 in every 4 women still experience some sort of physical or sexual violence in their life. So about 24% of all women experience this type of violence in a relationship. So when you think of domestic violence, primarily you think of a man abusing a woman because it's one of the most common scenarios, but is not necessarily the only scenario that has to do with domestic violence. So my knowledge question today is, to what extent does our knowledge in human sciences depend on sense perception and emotion based on facts and explanations? So I'm going to be focusing on the emotional aspect of the domestic violence, the sense perception, so the perception of each individual and how they perceive the violence taken upon them. So the victim, which is the women, and the man, we're going to be analyzing both of those different perspectives, as well as the human behavior and human conduct, and even going a little bit in depth into the psychological, how it connects to psychology and the psychological aspects of violence and domestic violence in general in this case. So like I said before, 1 in 4 women experience some sort of domestic violence in their life. We're focusing these numbers on women who are 18 years old or older, but there's also different statistics that have to do with a younger group of women, so girls and teenagers around the ages from 15 to 18, which is another big group that is part of this whole domestic violence circle and cycle, and it happens to them as well. And so mainly domestic violence happens for many different reasons. It can be cultural, so their ethnicity, their race, their religious affiliation, also if they have some sort of disability, their sexual orientation also has to do a lot with it. And the main claim for this presentation is that domestic violence should be told to everyone. So everyone should know about domestic violence, and everyone needs to understand that domestic violence is a serious problem, and it's a serious issue that occurs all over the world. So not just in the United States. I'm not just talking about the United States. All over the world, there are laws that are there to prevent domestic violence, but laws are not usually followed, and this is what I'm here to talk about. So now I'm going to get into an example. So one of the main examples and one of the most famous cases that had to do with domestic violence was the O.J. Simpson case. And this case happened in 1994. And so if you don't know, O.J. Simpson was an American football player. He was famous, he was beloved by many, he had a lot of fans, he was rich. But when they found out that his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and one of her friends, Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman, were found brutally murdered, he was one of the main suspects. And one of the reasons why this case is the most well-known of all domestic violence cases was because his trial was televised. So, and in the trial, there's proof that shows that Nicole Brown Simpson was being abused, was in an abusive relationship with O.J. Simpson. There are tapes that record her repeatedly calling the police and saying how she's being abused as well. Stockholm Syndrome also affects women who are in an abusive relationship, mainly because there's an emotional attachment between her and her partner, which, in how I said, the scenario that I'm focusing mainly on is the man is the abuser and the woman is the victim. So this bond is created because of small little acts of kindness that happen between them two. So the partner would say, "Oh, I love you, let me take you out to dinner, let me buy you this." Yet he still abuses her and hurts her, and that brainwashes the victim, that brainwashes the person into thinking on just focusing on the good things that happen and ignoring the fact that the person who they are with is actually bad and is bad for them and is hurting them, and they don't realize that. And it's like they keep coming back and they keep coming back together, and it's one of those things. It's one of those other like darker sides to the domestic violence issue that a lot of people don't report it, mainly because of this reason. They don't report it because of this reason. That is when a lot of people don't report it because of that reason, because of the Stockholm Syndrome thing that happens between the abuser and the victim. That is when the family members need to come into play. So people say that, oh, even though they keep coming back to the victim, what should I do? That is when family members and friends need to pay attention to the relationship of those two individuals. They need to see how there's signs that show that they are being physically abused. There's visual signs like bruises or cuts or scars or things like that. But there's also the way the victim sort of acts. That's what the family members need to pay attention to. And if they really want to help the person and if they really want to make a change, it is by trying to look at these signs and reporting them to the police. Because if a victim has Stockholm Syndrome, they're not going to report it. They're not going to, because they are emotionally attached to the abuser. And that's what I mean by human conduct and human behavior. This is the psychological human behavior viewpoint, and it's one of those things that impedes the domestic violence issue and the violence against women to not be completely resolved. Connecting back to what I said before, to my original claim, how domestic violence, people need to learn about domestic violence and they need to be aware of it and they need to know that it happens and they should know when to report it and it should be reported by the victim as well. Overall, bringing all of it together, domestic violence is one of those issues that is actually pretty hard to report and to solve. They've tried solving it, like I said, with laws and things like that. But necessarily, a lot of it, because of how the two individuals perceive their ideas and if they think that they're right or they're wrong, the emotional aspect as well as the human behavior aspect of it all, it is very complicated to find a solution to the domestic violence issue around the world. What I'm trying to say here, and my sort of just bringing all my thoughts together to end this video, because of all these three things, it is very hard, yet it is still possible. It is still possible, and you can still see that domestic violence, even though it is hard to find a solution to because of either the emotional impact, the human behavioral impact, how the two individuals, the victim and the abuser, perceive their reasoning behind their actions. All of it has to do with trying to explain to people violence against women is something that needs to be stopped. You know, violence against women is not right, and domestic violence is one of the bigger it's a really broad and big picture that is narrowed down into different scenarios and different perspectives depending on the two individuals who are being charged for this, like, domestic violence. So depends on the people, is what I'm saying. Depends on the people how the whole domestic violence issue turns out and how they're being abused and why they're being abused, the reasons behind it and the reasonings behind it. So trying to go back to what I said before, the statistics, and how I said 1 in 4 women being sexually and physically abused, it also has to account for homicides. So homicides, 1 in every 3 women who are murdered, it is because of domestic violence. And you know, you're connecting this back to also human trafficking and trafficking against women. Human trafficking is another really big issue that has to do with this domestic violence, you know. Women, all of this domestic violence and abuse, trafficking, things like that, a lot of it is women. A lot of it has to do with women. They are the ones who are accounted for more. And, you know, it all relates back to the fact that women are still seen as inferior. Women are still seen as the lesser sex, and that they don't have as much rights, and that is why a lot of them, that's why a higher percentage of them a higher percentage of the people who are accounted for domestic violence and human trafficking are women and young girls and little kids, mainly because they're seen as weaker, and they're seen as they don't have as much rights. So yeah, basically it all has to do with specific type of human behavior, the emotions, the human conduct, the perception of each individual. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I'm glad you guys decided to watch, and I hope it wasn't too long. But yeah, I hope I explained pretty much what I was trying to explain about how domestic violence relates to TOK and back to different real life situations like human trafficking and yeah.